We're going to try to get started now. We have people coming in, and it's taking a little longer in this weather, but it's a good crowd, and we're so delighted that this topic of the beer industry in Newark has really hit home. It looks like, to my eye, that a good third of you are kind of first-time participants in one of our Newark History Society programs. So a special welcome to you. And that gives me the chance to tell you that a group of us started the Newark History Society about 12 years ago now. And we've put on over 50 programs like this in that period of time. If you go to our website, newarkhistorysociety.org, you'll see the flyers for each one and a few of the papers that were presented. And it's also a good way to keep up with our plans for the future. Our goal in doing all of this was certainly to bring attention to Newark and Newark's history, which is as deep and complex and interesting as any urban history in the United States. But it was also to create, if I may, a civic space. And that's exactly what tonight is. People from all sorts of different places with different backgrounds and different interests coming because of a common interest in a particular topic. So again, welcome. Many of you are members. You have to go through this plug. We are an all-volunteer organization. Dues are only $25, and we're really grateful to those who conscientiously send them in. There are slips of membership slips that you can pick up here or on the table out there. We would really welcome your support. I do want to say thanks to Steve Tetamonte, who's standing in the back there, who's the executive director of the New Jersey Historical Society, for once again allowing us to meet here. I also want to thank Alan Delosier and the New Jersey Catholic Historical Commission, who raised his hand, mostly because of Tom McCabe, to co-sponsor tonight's program. I also want to give a quick update on one of our, here's Alan. I'll give him another plug once he gets in the room. Our Newark Archives project is one of our key programs. Alex Ross, who's along with Gail Malmgren doing that, is here tonight. We have established a website with descriptions of archival materials related to Newark history. And it is becoming the first place to look if you're working on any topic related to Newark. Gail and Alex have surveyed not only the New Jersey Historical Society, the Newark Public Library, the City Archives, the Newark Museum, Barringer High School Archives. They've been ensconced at Rutgers, New Brunswick recently, on their way down to Princeton very soon to survey archival materials related to Newark. We're delighted that the New Jersey Historical Commission is supporting this Newark Archives project. Warren, I think it's the 4th year now, with a new grant for 2014, and also the Delmas Foundation in New York is supporting us again as well. Alan, I'm going to repeat now that you've shown up to say thank you for the co-sponsorship. Really appreciate that. Our next program in March 24th, is going to have a different co-sponsor, and it's a first for us. The Women's Association at NJPAC has been following what we're doing and has been looking for an opportunity to do a joint program. And so on March 24th, our next meeting will actually be in the Chase Room at NJPAC. And George Robb, who many of you know, who's a professor of history at William Patterson University, a Newarker, is going to give a talk about, which we've titled Breaking Barriers, Newark Women in Business in the Early 20th Century. George is a first-rate historian, University of Texas graduate, Northwestern PhD. His first book was published by Cambridge University Press. We're just delighted that he's digging into our programs. I think he's in London this week, which otherwise I think he would be here. So the last thank you is to Bob Marasco, the city clerk, who arranges every time to videotape these programs, and they show on Channel 78 for those of you who live in Newark and have access to that channel. I just spoke to somebody today who said she saw my talk about the American Revolution. I had no idea that it had been broadcast, but it's good for it to be extended that way. So with that as the introduction, I want to introduce Tom McCabe. But actually, there was one more thing I wanted to do, was to get a show of hands. I've been getting all sorts of emails from people who are recalling their own experience with breweries in Newark. I know Paul Kyle was recalling the summer that he worked at Ballantine Brewery in 1952 before he went off to medical school with midnight to 8 a.m. shift. Are there others, I'm going to do this in Syria, are there others who worked at a Newark brewery, and the Anheuser-Busch people can raise their hands too, just to get some sense of who's here. So we've got a brother, okay, and I know we have Ted, so there are a good half a dozen, maybe some of those stories will come out later. Any relatives of people who ran or owned breweries in Newark? And Ted, you have to raise your hand here. Yeah, Ted Kastner, I think, Tom, you're going to mention the Kastner Brewery rather a few decades ago in Newark. So there are a lot of personal memories interwoven with the program tonight, and really grateful to Tom McCabe for pulling this together. He's going to provide a historical backdrop. Most of you know Tom, a graduate of Princeton and PhD from Rutgers University, has taught the history of Newark course here in Rutgers-Newark, teaches at St. Benedict's, and has recently published a book about the history of St. Benedict's. The Miracle on High Street is a good read. Is that enough of an introduction? Tom, here you go.
I'm going to make one announcement about another history program, and I'm going to tie it in to our discussion of beer. It's called Hometown Teams. I left a few cards out by the food, and it's sponsored by the Smithsonian, and it's a traveling exhibit called Hometown Teams: How Sports Shape America. It's right now installed at the Yogi Berra Museum on the campus of Montclair State. It will go to 5 other sites around New Jersey during this year. But at the Yogi Berra Museum, obviously Yankee files can go there and enjoy. There's a shot of the outfield with Ballantine placard there. And every time a Yankee hit a home run, the announcer would say, "A Ballantine blast." So Yankee fans drank Ballantine, and Met fans drank Rheingold. So beer and sport is alive and well. Huh. Oh. I want to start with King Gambrinus, the legendary king of Flanders, who is credited with being the first one to add hops to beer. He's considered one of the unofficial patron saints of beer, and his birthday or namesake day is April 11th, which is my birthday. So it's altogether fitting that I volunteered to put this panel together, from Ballantine to Anheuser-Busch, the beer industry in Newark. I'm excited to be one of the 3 speakers. We have Samantha, Lou, and Milt, who you'll meet a little bit later. And before we start, I just want to take a brief moment to ask King Gambrinus, who was affixed to the outside of the Kruger Brewing Company for decades, to watch over our proceedings. He was put there by Gottfried Kruger in 1883, survived in place till 1954 when he fell to the street, but don't despair, King Gambrinus II took his place. So these, historians love to package their history in eras or epochs or chunks of time, and I think we can do that tonight from these first microbrewers in the city all the way to now a microbrewing resurgence in the last 20 years or so. Consider this timeline Newark's six-pack. You're probably best to envision it in cans, though, because the Kruger Brewing Company was the first brewer to put beer in cans, which revolutionized the beer industry. Its impact was considerable because people changed the way they consumed beer. It was no longer exclusively in the tavern or off a draft. You could now get the packaged goods to go home. So a major innovation in the beer industry. I would suggest that many people here with knowledge of the brewing industry in Newark would say that the first brewer in the city was Peter Ballantine, and that he would have set up his shop on Rector Street or thereabouts, a beer bottle's throw from the Passaic River. Brewing in Newark predates this map, and if you can see in the top right-hand corner, it says 1806. So this is really Puritan Newark spreading out, and beer was here in the city as early as 1799. This is the shoemaker's map. As we can see from the legend on the left, the shoemaking industry in Newark was massive to its growth, but beer would be added as a key industry in the coming decades. If we zoom in on that map, we see these two blue spots. The blue spot down at the bottom is where Ballantine would have started, and others started their brewing operations right there, not far from us. But up on High Street, I guess it's also fitting that I wrote A Miracle on High Street, because according to Harry and Grace Weiss's 1963 book, The Early Breweries of New Jersey, the first brewer was John Cumming, and the first brewery was the High Street Brewery. Maybe that's the real miracle on High Street, the coming of beer to a Puritan stronghold in 1799. Here is an early ad from the 1820s. General John Cumming notified local farmers that he would pay the highest price for their barley, so he was able to produce a quality beverage, as it says here, not inferior to any made in the U.S. Newark brewers would stack their product up against any other in the country. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, and he brewed his porter, ale, and beer at that High Street brewery until 1831, when he sold it to Robert Morton. Here's an old shot of the Morton Brewery, which would have been the Cumming Brewery, and then also the site of the first Ballantine Brewery. The ad announced an auction of Newark's Cummings Brewery in the Albany Evening Journal, the very place where the Scotsman Peter Ballantine was living and working as a brewer. Perhaps he saw that Newark ad in 1831 because he came to Newark 9 years later in 1840, leaving upstate New York, coming here with his partner, Erastus Patterson. They set up the Patterson and Ballantine Brewing Company and occupied this plant for 6 years, after which Ballantine leased it for himself until 1850, when his 3 sons joined him in the enterprise and became Peter Ballantine and Sons Brewing Company. Thanks to the great website, Old Newark Photos, for some great shots of the breweries. Here, the 2 locations, the one close to us right now in NJ Pack. Some people might have even gone to classes in this building, because after it closed down, it became University of Newark, Rutgers-Newark, and then Science High School. But the brewing that started on High Street and then Rector Street, really eclipsed by the massive operations in the Ironbound, which has always been a cradle of brewing, not only in Newark and the state, but the country. So we have this forgotten father of brewing here in Newark, Herman Schalk of the Schalk family. And his father, Johann, and his brothers Adolf and Oscar come to Newark in 1841 to form the Schalk Brothers Brewery. According to the historian Joseph Atkinson, in his 1878 volume, it was the first lager beer brewed in the state. Some have said the country. I'm going to stick with the state. Johann came to Newark in 1849 in the wake of the failed political revolutions of 1848 in Germany. The father and sons began the business with only 12 bushels of malt. But I could argue that was those 12 bushels that saved the city during the American Civil War. More on that to come. Herman Schalk was one of the wealthiest and most prominent Newarkers. The first of the brewers that would be Ballantine and Kruger and Feigenspahn, prominent civic life as well. And that will be talked about a little bit later. He went on to be an alderman, excise commissioner, police commissioner, judge of a local circuit. But what we want to thank him for is that during a financial panic in 1865, when local banks, Newark banks, would not loan money to the city to cover their city expenses, good old Herman Schalk, who had made his money on beer from Newarkers and outside, took money from his own bank account to pay Newark's expenses. So saved the city in some respects from defaulting. The Schalk Brothers beer would suffer from its own panic in 1879, and Ballantine would buy that operation in the Ironbound. The Schalks were probably the first of the great German brewers to settle in Newark, but they weren't the first. William Bauer and William Schilling were. In 1830, Bauer sold lager to the entire German population of the city. 7 people. 3 years later, there were 75 Germans in Newark. And faithfully, he sold them that beer on Sundays. Wilhelm Schilling came along and made what was argued the first genuine lager beer in an old factory also on High Street, all before the Schalks arrived in 1849. But before the Schalk beer saved the city, it led to what I would call and have called Newark's forgotten riot, beer that is, or its resultant cause of this civil strife, Newark's 19th century culture war. The Germans in Newark loved their lager beer, their Sanger fests, and beer gardens. They held firmly to their language and to their customs. The drinking and singing in those gardens on Sundays in particular irked the Protestant establishment, who saw the German influx along with the Irish immigration as a menace. So in September of 1854, a bunch of American Protestant Association members from Brooklyn, from Manhattan, from New Jersey, from Newark, march along Broad Street. They stop, have some lunch, a liquid lunch, you could argue, perhaps some German lager. They get their beer muscles and they go charging up William Street and stop outside a small church, St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church. They are going to play their songs, sing their ditties, and eventually it leads to a riot. 2 Irish Catholic tanners are killed. The marchers leave the city, none arrested. St. Mary's builds bigger and better, found St. Benedict's Prep, and that is how I open the history miracle on High Street. But it really underlines the animosity that the establishment had towards Germans and had towards Catholics. There was a German town not far from that church, and this is a sketch from Harper's Weekly, and I'll quote from the 1876 piece written by Martha Lamb. Very interesting. It's a woman as well writing for this national publication in the 1870s. Quote, "A wondrous tide of Germans has flooded Newark, dropping to all the vacant lots about the factories and spreading itself over the flats to the east and the hills to the southwest, until it numbers about 1/3 of the voting population. The German quarter on the hill is one of the interesting features of the city. A section of nearly 2 miles square is a snug, compact, well-paved city within a city, giving evidence of neither poverty nor riches. The Germans who dwell here are chiefly employed in the factories, and nearly all own their own homes. They live economically and save money. German habits and German customs appear on every side. There are 8 or 10 immense breweries within the district. So the Germans love their beer and found it as a way into the entrepreneurial class. Some of the examples would be Joseph Hensler Brewing Company. He joined the Schalk brothers before departing for the Lorenz and Jacquillard Brewery. Hensler ends up marrying Jacquillard's widow and then taking sole possession of the brewery in 1866. As mentioned before, the Kastner brothers found the Phoenix Brewery, which had a 7, 8, 9-year run, and they used this mythic bird well before Sharp James did after another riot towards the end of the 20th century. Of course, we have this great lithograph of the Kruger Brewery, circa 1880, from the Newark Public Library. So these were block-long plants, just like other businesses in the city, whether it was Clark Thread or Murphy Varnish, Johnson & Murphy Shoe Company. Newark was a manufacturing city that made things, and immigrants came here for work, and they wanted their thirst quenched. I love some of these shots. Here we have the beer wagon of the Kruger Brewing Company. And this is the only shot I could find of an aerial shot of the Fegenspan Brewery in the Ironbound with that illuminated sign that so many people talk about, P-O-N, Pride of Newark Beer. This was the cover shot for the newsletter or the pamphlet announcing the program. Comes from the 1880s. Only a few short years after Peter Ballantine inaugurated his legendary trademark in 1879. As the story goes, Ballantine had observed 3 rings left on a wooden table by a wet beer glass. In those 3 rings, he saw his company's new logo, which came to stand for purity, body, and flavor. The Ballantines moved their operation down neck and consolidated and acquired other breweries. The Schalk Brewery is mentioned in 1879 and eventually the Fegenspan Brewery in 1943. You can see parts of this massive plant still there. I'm sure someone later in the program is going to talk about what happens to the breweries in the 60s and 70s. But before Prohibition, we have just a density of brewing in this part of the city. This is the Ironbound, and you can see from the names in the top left-hand corner, you have the Ballantine Brewery. Right across Bowery Street, you have the Christian Fegenspan Brewery, more property owned by the Fegenspans. We have Schalk Street down in the bottom left-hand corner, and then more Ballantine property abutting the Passaic River. So this is on the eve, if you will, of Prohibition. You don't see many shots of the interior of saloons. I have no idea where this takes place. We can probably guess early 1900s. Magnificent bar there, but this would have been a working man's saloon, and it would have been a community center where you would talk jobs, talk politics, talk sports, a place to escape. Many of the breweries sponsored saloons to get their product placed there. I've read that 80 to 90% of these taverns were sponsored by the breweries. This one is the PON, Pride of Newark Bar and Grill on Clinton and Huntington Streets here in Newark. The prevalence of these saloons concerned many people, especially the progressives. This is a document that I use as an example of the progressive era movement in my History of Newark class, and it literally tallies up positive and negative social institutions. So if you look at the negative, we have saloons, dance halls, gambling houses, tottering over 140, and then positive, churches and missions and public libraries and a settlement house. I think that number says 8. So the saloons are clearly outnumbering these positive, healthful institutions. Willard Price, the author of this report, calls the ironbound Beer Island. So we move into this period of Prohibition. This is a shot from the city dump in Newark, and we all know about Prohibition. Comes into law in 1918, and it inflicts serious damage on the Newark breweries, large and small. Ballantine manufactured malt syrup at that former Schalk brewery in the Ironbound, but had to close its Front Street plant after 8 decades. That malt house eventually becomes Rutgers-Newark and Science. Feigenspahn applied for a license to make near beer. One druggist in town was the first one to offer that to willing patients, and the first one to get it was an 89-year-old woman who couldn't do without it. She was going crazy, she said. In a previous Newark history program, we've talked about how there was still a wet and wild feature to Newark. Warren Grover, co-president of the society, talked about Abney Longy-Zwillman. One reporter commented that Newark glittered like the mouth of hell during the Prohibition era. And the 18th Amendment was designed to curb the evils of alcohol, but there was all sorts of illegal activity in the city, speakeasies, gang warfare, and bootlegging. I just have one article from that era, and the title reads, "Saloons Booming in Newark Again, Dry Law Jeered. Cafes reap harvest, sell openly, laugh at Prohibition. Old days returning." This is the Newark Sunday Call from October of 1923. Laura Troiano turned me on to this book and good old Colonel Ira Reeves, and it is a remembrance of the Prohibition era. He is the state official trying to curb abuses, and we can see him here basically taking a gas attendant to task because he wasn't advertising alcohol in the right way. In his book, he details this great event. There are many of them, but this is the one I wanted to share with you. So they seize many barrels of beer, and now they're going to take that out to the city dump and do something like this to it. So he says here it's in the middle of an industrial population, and shortly after the agents began unloading the barrels, a large, thirsty crowd began to take the barrels away from the federal men. They were overwhelmed and absolutely helpless, he writes. The crowd overran the lot and were soon engaged in rolling the barrels to the nearest street, where they were quickly loaded into waiting trucks and passenger automobiles and hurried away. The incident, he says on the other page, taught me a lesson: never to sanction the destruction of any quantity of beer in the presence of a large crowd, especially on a hot, sweltering day. So Newarkers had enough, as much as the country had with Prohibition. Here we have some weary Newarkers in the early 1930s staging a massive rally demanding the legalization of beer. 40,000 gathered in Military Park chanting, as you see on the sign, or if you can't read it, it says, "We want beer. We want beer." And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is known for a lot, but he's also known for beer coming back shortly after his election. Women were involved as well. A year later, they turned out in large numbers, not as many, only 20,000 this time, but again, an anti-prohibition parade and demonstration in 1932. So, repeal comes to Newark, and several hours before midnight on April 6, 1933, hundreds of Newarkers in front of the Kruger Brewing Company on Belmont Avenue just stared at the king. As midnight approached, the crowd grew restless. Horns blew, sirens screeched, traffic came to a standstill, and at the stroke of midnight, a Kruger beer truck rolled into the street, and the crowd went wild. A spotlight shone on King Ganderness, and the sale of beer was now legal, and as the song went, happy days are here again. Thank you. I am now going to introduce Samantha Boardman, who has spoken in front of this society before on the Kruger-Scott Mansion. She's involved in an African-American oral history program here in Newark with her advisor. She's a PhD candidate in American Studies at Rutgers-Newark. So she's going to come up here. I'm going to go turn on a little movie, and then she'll continue with the program.
Thank you all so much. Okay, so a number of years back, I had the great good fortune to get to make a short video documentary on the history of the Kruger-Scott Mansion. And one of the places where I did a lot of research was right here in the library at the New Jersey Historical Society. And so I'm just going to play a little clip from the film that kind of shows the sort of unparalleled opulence of the beer baron era in the late 19th century in Newark. This is just about Godfrey Kruger and his erection of the mansion. So this is just a little clip, and I'll talk a little bit more.
Godfrey Kruger was one of the big 5 beer brewers.
He was a beer baron, as they called it. There was a famous beer back then called Kruger's Beer.
Of course, Godfrey Kruger and the Kruger beer and all the things that he did.
Godfrey Kruger was born in Germany in 1837 and immigrated to Newark at the age of 15. He worked his way up from sweeping floors in his uncle's brewery to helming his own brewing company. His namesake brewery would later achieve renown as the first company in the U.S. to offer beer in cans. Kruger's interests extended into civic life as well, establishing numerous charitable organizations and holding a number of public offices.
He was a wonderful, very giving man who had gotten a great deal from his citizenship, and he gave a great deal back.
As his fortunes and family grew, Kruger commissioned the construction of a massive mansion on what was then the most fashionable street in the city.
High Street was the core of the German upper class in Newark. The Krugers were Germans and didn't give a damn about the old WASP hierarchy.
It became a great silk stocking district in the days of the Kruger Mansion. Many other great homes were built along High Street.
High Street was occupied by the people who were the civic leaders of the city. And they had their houses and they had their mansions on this street before it was renamed the Martin Luther King Boulevard. The reason it was named High Street is because of the geographic location of the street. It was at the highest level in the city of Newark.
He wanted to put something high on the hill that was majestic to show the world that he had arrived.
Kruger's mansion boasted 3 stories, 40 rooms, and a brass-domed stained glass oculus that shone down to the grand staircase below.
This was apparently Kruger's library. Because when I was a kid, there were cabinets, wooden glass cabinets enclosed all around this room.
Rooms featured custom-carved cabinetry and opulent decorations.
When Mr. Kruger built this house, he told the architect to outdo the Ballantine house. His house should be better than the Ballantine house. And it was. And it did.
Completed in 1889, the mansion cost $250,000 and was the most expensive residence ever built in Newark.
It was a grand, flamboyant beer baron's house.
I especially love the picture with the cheetah pelt.
Yes.
I think that really that says it all. It was a very special pre-income tax time for the beer barons. So while conducting research for the film, a lot of these images come from the Cummings room, a lot of them come from the archive here, and I think it might have been Maureen O'Rourke who said, and you know we have the Parrott thesis. And I was like, what's the Parrott thesis? It sounded so mysterious. I was trying to find out more information about Gottfried Kruger, and there wasn't a whole lot. There were snippets here and there in articles about the house, but nothing really comprehensive. And so she handed me this document, and it was a thesis written by a man named Louis Parrott, and it was called The Politics of Beer. And it was on 3 of the brewing families here in Newark, Fegenspan, Kruger, and Ballantine. And it was one of the most comprehensive documents on Newark history I've ever seen. It was meticulously researched, very clearly well written, and kind of like the unicorn that anybody who's doing some research would hope would fall into their lap when they're trying to find out something about a subject. So Mr. Parrott is here tonight. I'm delighted that he was able to join us this evening. He is a teacher of U.S. History and Social Studies at Barnegat High School. And without any further ado, Lou Parrott.
I don't know if I can live up to that introduction, really. But yeah, I was just amazed when Tom reached out to me. I got an email, I think, from Maureen, who used to work here in the building. I did a lot of my research upstairs. I was surprised that nobody had touched on these guys before. I mean, really, these 3 men, the patriarchs of these families anyway, they would have been successful men in any industry that they set their mind to. They're like what we would consider a type A personality, for sure. All 3 of them. Ballantine, Peter Ballantine, Godfrey Kruger, and Christian Feigenspahn. That's why I like to call them unfettered capitalists. And why I mean that is just they really had their way around the city and could do what they wanted because through various political connections, Kruger and Ballantine, they were in control. They did what they needed to do. Now, as far as Ballantine goes, I couldn't find any. Now, first, I must apologize for anybody any ancestors of these 3 families that are in the room for some of the things I might say. This is what I uncovered when I was doing my research. One thing I can say on the positive side, for the Ballantine family, I couldn't really find any skeletons in their closet. And I did look, but there weren't any. There was just one grandson committed suicide at some point for some reason which wasn't really stated anywhere by the family. I found no papers, primary source documents for the family, unfortunately. Now for the Krugers, they played a little fast and loose with the rules. So let me just start. Let me start with Ballantine anyway. This is the gentleman here up on the top. That is Peter Ballantine. He's the patriarch of the family. Now he arrives in America in 1820. He's from Scotland. And there's even conflicting reports of where he's born. I found some information where he was born in the northern western part of Scotland, and most likely he was probably born closer to the south, because the other gentleman was a falconer who never left Scotland. So he's got to be him. But he marries Julia Wilson in 1830. So he's a malt salesman for the Albany Brewers. And this is the connection between Albany and, which kind of goes about because they advertised the Morton Brewery in a Albany newspaper. So as Tom mentioned, more than likely Ballantine probably did see that ad, or because of his sales job, and the steamboats were running back and forth up and down the Hudson at that point in time already. So I'm going to guess that he probably made a journey to Newark beforehand, met with Morton and knew him, okay? And that's how he comes down here. First he comes with his family, by himself, then he comes with his family and he buys the existing brewery that, not directly from General Cummings, he buys it directly from Morton. But General Cummings is another interesting character. The name Cummings still goes around too. Actually, I think that might be a typo. It's Cumming, right?
Correct.
Yeah, there's no S, so I apologize. There's my first mistake already. Okay? So I apologize for that. Okay, so Cumming. But he fought in the Revolutionary War too, as a matter of fact. My research found that, but I don't know. Okay, now their connections via the families, you got Frelinghuysen, now this is where I couldn't reconcile this. Theodorus Frelinghuysen is an old school preacher Puritan. He's Dutch, okay? That he kind of allowed his family to marry into the Ballantines, who were brewing beer, and he was part of, some of the family members were part of the Anti-Saloon League. I couldn't reconcile that idea. I was wondering, maybe they just thought, well, beer's okay, but stay away from that hard stuff. You know, I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, Freelandhausen, and there might be, I hope there's, if there is somebody in the, any relatives of them, that's a long line, a famous family in Newark. Rodney is still a congressman in, for New Jersey. So he's directly related to Peter Ballantine, patriarch of the Ballantine family. Okay? Now Bradley, Joseph Bradley was a Supreme Court justice, okay, in the 1800s. And his son, Charles, married into the Ballantine family and actually became one of 3 men that ran the company after Robert F., who was the son. That's not Robert there, unfortunately. That is John, if I'm not mistaken. That the gentleman on the bottom. But Robert looked a lot like him, so you can say he looks a little bit like him. Okay? So, their political connections in Newark read like a who's who of Newark. I mean, look, Thomas McCarter, Carter Highway, Cortlandt Parker, okay? For their political affiliations, they started out as Whigs. Now, this was another thing that was odd. When I was doing my research, I come across there were members of the Clay Club. Henry Clay ran for president numerous times during this time in the 1830s, 1840s, and they said that Peter H. Ballantine was a member of the Clay Club. Peter H. Ballantine, not the father there, is the son. He would have been 14 years old at the time. So I don't know how that worked, but that's what I found. Because I never found in my research that Peter, the father, had a middle initial. But the Peter Hood Ballantine name weaves its way through all these families. There's a Peter Hood Ballantine Freelandhausen. There's a Peter Hood Ballantine Cumming. So this name keeps weaving its way through the family. Now that's the son of Peter Ballantine, who actually predeceased him. Peter Ballantine died in 1883. His son, Peter, not his namesake as far as I know, he wasn't a junior, he died in 1882. Okay? So he died before his dad. And they belonged to every club you can think of in Newark area, country clubs, various places. Robert F. Ballantine, his resume was long, that's for sure. Okay, now, but interesting characters. Griswold, another point, Griswold. The Griswold family was a famous merchant family from New York City, and they weave their way through the Ballantine family also. One thing that Robert did, Robert had one son. He was the last member of the direct family that was running the brewery in the early 1900s, and his son died in infancy, so he had 3 daughters, and he made sure they married the people that he wanted them to marry. Okay, so one daughter married a Bradley, one married a Pitney, the other one married a Griswold. And they were all well-known families of the time, wealthy, great pedigrees. So that's one thing that I found, and this is the connection really with all these three brewers. The fathers all made sure that their daughters married the people that they wanted to. And that's just the way it was back then. Romantic love wasn't a thing in that time frame. So, now, for Kruger comes, and the story, this interesting tale, I don't know whether this was true or not, but this was a story that I found in a few different sources, saying that Godfrey Kruger arrived at his Uncle Brewery wearing wooden shoes. So, and he was virtually penniless, okay? He comes to work in John Leibel's brewery in roughly, let's see, it's 1850 1857. I think that's when he arrives. But believe it or not, by 1865, he's already running his own place. So he starts sweeping up floors in his uncle's brewery in 1857, and within a short 7-8 years later, he's running his own place with a tavern along the side, and he's living above. Let's talk about type A, okay? Without a doubt. I don't know if anybody could do that today. All right, and this is the other interesting thing. He's married twice. His first his wife, he has 3 sons that lived through adulthood. He marries Bertha, who's actually his first cousin. And I found that interesting for that time frame. I don't know, historically whether that would be okay, but I mean, listen, Roosevelt was married, but Eleanor was his second cousin. Here, Bertha is his first cousin. Now, I came across a blog where one of the ancestors said that Bertha was a distant relative of John, but in the census shows him as his daughter, okay? And the connection, the reason why I grabbed Feigenspan and Kruger were brother-in-laws. Both were married to Leibel's daughters, Bertha and Rachel. They never spoke to each other. I couldn't find any information written that connected Godfrey Kruger and Christian Feigenspan together. Now here they are, they're 2 German brewers, they're brother-in-laws, they're working in the same city, but no connection anywhere on paper. So I always like to say, why did that happen? I don't know. I mean, I know some dysfunctional families, but not talking at all. Okay, all right, so here's another interesting fact of now I kind of just looked more at the people themselves and their political connections. I didn't really get into the companies, but this was one thing that I did come across, which I found interesting. In the late 1800s, the English were coming over here because there was, the English economy was going down, and the investors had a lot of money to spend. And Kruger one thing he was smart. He realized, hey, I got some good capital. So he consolidates with Hulk, Treves, Hoffel, and the Albany Brewing Company. There's the Albany connection again, to raise capital for expansion. So he sells the company to English investors for like $2.5 million. Now this is $2.5 million in 1890 dollars. That's a lot of money. Okay, I wouldn't even want to guess it would have, but it's a lot. All right. All right, here's Kruger's, another picture of Kruger, and there is his mausoleum, which you can go visit. This is at Fairmont Cemetery. I went and took some shots. I don't know, that's not my shot, though. That's one that you found somewhere else. Right. I went and took pictures of myself. But there's Kruger, a little bit younger. He's probably there. That's from the Western Brewer. Part of that picture that Samantha showed a couple minutes ago, that would have been in the 1890s, those pictures. So roughly he's what, maybe about 50 years old there. Okay, but look at the way the Ballantine, when I went to visit the Ballantine Cemetery, they're buried at Mount Pleasant, which is, a much older cemetery. And they just have small little headstones. Kruger and Feigenspan have these giant monoliths, these monuments to their lives. So they wanted everybody to know, hey, look at me. Okay, now, here's his political connections. And this is where I found the most interest here. Okay, so his forceful personality, he's in political office, he's a freeholder first, then he becomes a state assemblyman, and he's ultimately a lay judge of the New Jersey State Court of Appeals, Errors and Appeals under Governor Abbott. Now the key is here, they're all Democrats, okay? Governor Abbott apparently owes a favor to this man, James Smith Jr. Now I use the term corrupt politician, not loosely. Most of the information that I found about him, he played pretty fast and loose but it is New Jersey after all, okay? So a corrupt politician in New Jersey? I don't know. I'm shocked. Anyway, I always wanted to pursue later on to see how tightly they held the voting in between the Irish and the German in Newark during this time frame when they were at their height of their power. After Smith's father was a alderman and Kruger was his pallbearer. So I gotta keep going. Okay, all right. I gotta move along. Get off the stage. All right, so Kruger persuaded his daughter Lily, and that's where I got a lot of this information. Lily was entered into a loveless marriage, so it just goes to show how Kruger held sway over his family. Okay, and they were related. Hulk was involved with them too. They also ran afoul of Palmer, custodian of alien property. As Tom was talking about, there was a lot of German I want to say animosity towards them during World War I because Kruger had his property seized. Okay, so now moving on to Feigenspan, he arrives in Newark in 1866 and he works for Leibel also. Now that's Kruger's uncle. Now I couldn't find out the information whether Kruger was still together with Leibel then or he'd already left. The sources kind of conflict. But by 1869, here he is, he arrives 3 years later, he owns his own brewery with another person. Again, type A guy, okay? They enjoyed their greatest success under Christian W., and that's where the Parrott of New York comes in. That's his eldest son. He had another brother, Edwin, but Feigenspan didn't live as long as Kruger. Kruger wound up living a long life. Feigenspan didn't, okay? In 1900, he introduced that Pride of Newark beer, and Christian as the president, he fought prohibition through the courts. Now this is Feigenspan the Elder. There's his monument at Fairmont Cemetery. So you can see that too, that still exists. That's a recent photo, all right? Just one thing, and again, a connection with Palmer. I like to refer to Palmer as Woodrow Wilson's pit bull. Because any dirty job that Wilson needed done, when he didn't want to get his hands dirty, Palmer did it. Okay? And he went back to the banking business after he lost his case, and he remained there until Prohibition ended, and his brother ran the company and they sold it to Ballantine. There is a picture of their lager at the height of their power there in the 1880s, 1890s. This is how well he was looked. That's artist depiction that was found in Thomas Fleming's book, A Real History of Newark and Notable Newarkers. Okay? And that's what I got for you. Thank you very much for your time.
And I'm going to introduce our last speaker on the panel, Milt Rosko, a 45-year employee of Anheuser-Busch. So he's going to bring the story away from the Feigenspan, the Krugers, the Ballantines, to this great brewer from the Midwest coming to Newark.
Thank you very much for your applause, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start off telling you a story how I got involved in the brewing business in the state of New Jersey. Frankly, I have a love affair with the city of Newark for a number of reasons. I was born and delivered by a midwife on Chelsea Avenue in Newark 83 years ago. And at the time, my parents lived in Newark, and I was born and raised in Newark. I went to the Newark school system, which at the time was a great school system. And to this day, I can remember teachers taking such concern and interest in me as I grew up. And I often reminisce about an English teacher who would mark my papers, and I'd get home and I'd read them, and she'd say, "Milton, keep trying, eventually you'll get it right." And from that beginning, I had a great respect for teachers. And I went to Lincoln School, a grammar school, and Ivy Street School in Newark, for those of you who are in Newark, graduated from West Side High School. It was just fantastic. What happened as I was growing up, and I backtrack a bit to when I was a pre-teener, I can remember to this day, I had a grandfather that lived in Elizabeth, I had a grandfather that lived in Irvington, and my dad and mom lived with us at Newark. And when the men wanted a beer, they would go out with a growler. Now a growler is nothing more than a little pail with a top on it. And they would get draft beer. And I make mention of this to try to give you a perspective of what you've heard thus far over what it was as opposed to what it turned out to be as time went on. At that time, packaged beer that was placed in bottles, constituted less than 15% of the total sale of beer. The other 85% beer was draft beer. Now, very few people even to this day realize what the difference is. The difference is that draft beer is not pasteurized. It's brewed and it must be kept refrigerated at all times, and then it must be served promptly. And the key in serving it is to use all the proper temperatures and clean glassware and to get the maximum flavor out of the beer. Well, at that time, the number of breweries didn't even produce packaged beer. Those that did produce packaged beer, many of them didn't have the knowledge or the technology to understand that packaging the beer is altogether different than serving it on draft. Now what happened is many of them would use clear glass bottles, and they would place the draft beer in the clear glass bottles, and then they would seal the bottle literally by hand with a little rubber stopper that went in there. Now that beer would then deteriorate quite quickly because as it got warm, the beer would continue to ferment in the bottle as opposed to being stabilized. So as a result, many of the brewers that you saw in these various pictures and may have read about going back into the late 1800s or pre-Prohibition days, many of those beers, if you try to produce them in cans or bottles at that time, the beer wouldn't taste good. So people continued to drink out using growlers, and basically another problem with the packaged beer when you bought it, even if you didn't try to take care of it, it would deteriorate. And I reminisce even back to when I was a youngster. When I was a teenager, we still had an ice box on the back porch of Sanford Avenue. We didn't have a refrigerator in those days. So that tells you how things have changed drastically. Now as time went on, and we got from that period when after repeal, and you got into the 1930s up until about the mid-1940s, most of those brewers could exist and continue in the old-fashioned way that they operated in the pre-Prohibition era. But then what happened, and you can see it in Newark, if you were to view a map that showed you the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area, and I'm expanding this from Newark a bit to give you a little perspective. In all my career, I studied and worked with about 17 breweries in the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area. That included Schaefer and Feigenspan, Knickerbockers from New York, and then Tromer's, which was located in Orange, and Peter Bright's, which was in Elizabeth. But there were 17 substantial breweries. Problem is, most of them dated back to pre-Prohibition days. So they were not by any means state-of-the-art. And I won't go into detail as to which ones were doing things and which ones weren't. But in the pre-Prohibition days, the brewers would literally go out and they'd buy the business, so to speak. There was no governmental controls. so they could spend money any way that they wished. And in doing so, they basically bought neighborhoods. And in those days, it was not unusual that every couple of blocks there was a tavern, and that's where everybody went to buy their beer. Well, as we got into the days after Prohibition, when we got into 1933 and beyond, the federal government and also the state governments prohibited that type of activity, so that the brewers could no longer be involved and get their little niche market. And there was a lot of, how should I term it, irregularities that went on to it. I'm trying to use the choice words because I didn't understand when I arrived that this might be on television. So as time went on, and a number of things came into play. All of these breweries located in specific geographic areas had good markets. And their basic draft beers that they produced, most of them were fine quality, that were taken care of, properly sold, etc. Now, as time went on, the breweries got to be places where they were great places to have a job. And I mention that because I can honestly say that in my entire career at Anheuser-Busch, every single employee that we had working in that company, and there was times we had as many as 1,500 people working at Newark, everyone had an excellent job. And in part, it was the company, but it also in part, it was a Teamsters union. Well, what happened as time went on, the Teamsters union tried to bring forward much of the practices that existed in pre-Prohibition to post-Prohibition. Well, there was a big difference. Times were changing, business was changing, the world was growing up, so to speak. Well, at that time, so was I growing up. So I worked in my dad's produce store. He sold fresh vegetables and fruits, and I delivered orders to a person by the name of Charlie Blatt, who was an office manager for Anheuser-Busch. Well, as Anheuser-Busch, what do they do? Well, they're a brewer. So anyway, he convinced me when I graduated high school that I should come to work for them, that they were expanding a program so that they could be state-of-the-art in handling all of their accounting. So before I even worked a day for the company directly, they sent me to school because there was a new gadget on the market called a National Cash Register accounting machine. Well, this was a massive thing, and there was a competitive product also called the Burroughs bookkeeping machine. These machines literally, and you computer buffs and iPod owners know what I'm talking about, they literally had more than 100 buttons on the top. You'd push button 1, 3, 5, 7, you'd search around there pushing the buttons. But anyway, to make a long story short, it was the beginning of what Anheuser-Busch was doing. Even, this is 5 years before the brewery was built. This is 1948. So I went to school and I learned how to operate one of these machines. And it was a great big thing. In other words, at that time, everybody used manual records, added up the numbers and subtracted the returned empties, etc. Except in our case, we were doing it state-of-the-art. You had a neat ledger card, you inserted that in the machine, it brought up the old balance for them, you punched in the new numbers, and you knew exactly how much is owed. It centralized billing, and it was the beginning. And I use that as an example because everything that we did at Anheuser-Busch was very similar in that regard, that you were moving up to state-of-the-art in the post-Prohibition era. Now, at that time, most of these, and let me give you a perspective. That was 1948, 49, 50. In that era, Anheuser-Busch decided to build a brewery at Newark. When they decided to build it, I went to the groundbreaking, as did a few of our other employees, because we only had about a dozen people working for the company at that time. And we had the groundbreaking, and 2 weeks later I get a letter drafting me into the service. So I'm drafted into the Marine Corps and spend 2 years during the Korean War before I was released at the time. So that was just enough time to get the brewery built. They built it, took two years to build it. So getting back, and here we are, and most of you I'm sure know where the brewery is here in Newark. It was the second brewery that the company owned, and it was built with the most modern technology going. But the availability of land in Newark was still relatively limited, so it is a multi-level brewery in the sense that everything is done on 2 or 3, 4 levels. Since that time, all of the breweries that were built, 10 additional breweries throughout the country, they were all built like what you might call a ranch house brewery. One level, and that was it, because it was more efficient and effective doing it that way as opposed to being multi-level. The thing is that here, as the Newark Brewery was, they worked with Mayor Ellen Stein at that time, and there were some agreements made to benefit the company to build in Newark. But the thing that the location had was something that no other breweries really had. You were located on routes 1 and 9, which was a great route. You had the New Jersey Turnpike there, but most importantly of all, you were on rail lines so that you could get everything in. All of the materials needed to brew beer came in by rail. All of the packaging materials, that all came in by rail. Then everything that was sent out was basically sent out by rail throughout the Northeast. And so there was minimal cost. The other breweries, because they were basically dependent on the local area for most of their business, it didn't really matter if it took longer to get material in or send material out. Almost everything went in and out by truck, which was very, very costly. So this put Anheuser-Busch at a decided advantage. Collectively, as you look at all of those things put together, a brewery like Pabst is an example, because I live in Vailsburg, so I go by it almost every day. Here was a brewery located on South Orange Avenue in Newark, where there was no rail, there was no highway, there was nothing. It was like difficult to get everything in and everything out, which when it's difficult, it's costly. So it just was, and everything was old and nothing was state of the art. So one at a time, those other brewers started to falter. A lot of them joined together to try to survive, and it just didn't work. So what would happen there is we basically were doing several things correctly. And I make mention of all of this type of things because you're all in different businesses. But I'm trying, if I can impress you with one thing that's so important, is staying state of the art in this day and age. It's more important today than it was even back 40 or 50 years ago when I was working in the industry. You keep moving things up and moving them up all the time. So what would happen here is a little, let's say, just a brewery, forget names. This brewery suddenly finds out that a couple things that it was doing before. First of all, as the prior speaker said, it was they were beer barons, let me put it that way. They lived a good life. They didn't invest back into their businesses. A lot of that money should have been poured back in. In the case of the Teamsters wouldn't listen to reason and try to understand that as technology became different, they should adapt to the situation. As an example, I can give you 100. I have to move along here, but in Jersey City, as an example, where we would deliver beer to, the Teamsters, when they had horse and wagons, they would put 2 wagons into Jersey City. One would deliver up on the top of the hill, the other would deliver down on the bottom of the hill. But you couldn't take a team of horses with a load of beer because it was too steep a hill to go up to. Well, in 1948, when we had trucks, the truck could sure drive up the hill, but the union wouldn't let you do that. You know, so this is one example. I could give you 100, where it took years of fighting and arguing to get rid of that kind of a situation so that you could get the trucks to do it right. Eventually, computers we had were taking a day's deliveries to be made and plot it so you get the most efficient, least costly amount of mileage to get the maximum amount of product delivered. Those are the kind of things that gave Anheuser-Busch a decided advantage, and one by one, the brewers would start dropping off and just have to close down because they could not keep up. Now, it's a sad commentary that had to happen, but have I got a couple more minutes yet? Okay, two or 3 minutes. But as time went on, the sad part of the situation is something that I'll give you a couple of examples. There was 703 breweries in 1930. By 1980, that number was down to 89 in the United States. So that as they all failed. But what happened in all those breweries, and I'd include breweries such as Coors, which is a major brewery, and Miller's, and Anheuser-Busch as well, the beer baron situation continued. Now, these men, like at Anheuser-Busch, the Busch family, I was very friendly with them all, from the father to the third and to the fourth. All of them, in the early stages, did a great job, built the company, but what happened, as they became beer barons, they had private jets, they had corporate jets. Nobody would fly on a regular jet anymore. It was all hop on, they will send the plane into Newark, pick you up, and this and that. This is what happened. So suddenly, after I retired, at the time I retired, our share of market was 49.5%. Well, the companies failed to realize, say about 15, 18 years ago, that you can't, when you get to that level, and then Coors and Miller combined had another 35%, you're not going to go anywhere in the beer business because you got to find someplace else to sell your products. Other companies in Europe and other places were expanding their products throughout the world, where we did at Anheuser-Busch did not do that. So what happened is, after about close to 10 years of no growth of sales nor growth of profitability, expansion, because the company failed to move into other areas, in the brewing area in particular, what happened, there was a shareholders meeting called 3 years ago approximately at the Meadowlands Hilton, where the Busch family controlled only 3% of the corporate stock. The other 97% was controlled by what I call the Wall Street establishment. Well, they were just to the point that the stock price was flat. There wasn't any increased sales, no way of generating additional revenue. So Wall Street, at that meeting, permitted a hostile takeover by a Belgian company called InBev. They came in, took over the company, and that was the end of the Anheuser-Busch era as we knew it, of being a great American company. So what happened then is InBev didn't have enough money to buy the company. The company cost $53 billion to buy. But what they did, they borrowed $53 billion. They came in and then they just got rid of all subsidiary companies within Anheuser-Busch. And when they did that, they used that money to pay back part of the 53 in the first year's installment. Then as revenue grew throughout the United States with our 12 breweries throughout the country, that money goes to pay off the 53 billion. So then what happens is just a couple of weeks ago, there's an announcement made that they took $5 billion of that profitability and it's being used to buy a brewery in South Korea. Well, you know, that's what's happened. What used to, for so many years, all that being poured back into the American economy, that's all just going elsewhere. And in closing, as I was preparing some notes, I recognized that the same thing happened just 2 weeks ago. You've all heard of Jim Beam bourbon, right? Well, Jim Beam was just now bought by a foreign company for $5 billion. That is no longer, so every bottle of Jim Beam that you buy, all the profits are taken out of the country. You know, I just make this, you know, it starts to sound a little negative, but I think this is what's happening that people don't recognize, and it's what's changed the industry. But today you have, Anheuser-Busch has 99 million barrels, Miller's 39.8, Coors 22.7, and then miscellaneous is another 37 million of the 199 million barrels that's being produced. But the one thing that I would also say is that in credit to Anheuser-Busch and to all the people that worked at that company, they were all excellent employees for the most part. I saw 3 generations in my lifetime work for that company, and they all were great people to work with, and they helped build what I viewed as a really great company. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists. Hopefully we have some time for questions, statements, proclamations. Yes?
There's been a story that the brewery across from the airport may close. What's the right story?
Milt, can you answer that?
I can't officially say anything because I really don't know. But if you remember, I said at the outset about the design of the brewery is not as effective and as low cost operation as a brand style brewery was on one level. But let me state this: that the company, you know, I tried to say as much as I could in this time frame. So what's happening? There's a lot of things taking place that are causing beer drinkers to turn elsewhere now. That's starting to, the sales have all been flat. So now the beer sales are moving elsewhere a little bit because there are now more than 2,000 microbrewers in the United States, which never existed back in, I just said when I quoted 89 breweries. That was just a few years ago, there was only 89 in the country. Now, what's happened, Anheuser-Busch has taken some, what I feel are a poor choice of things that they did, is I could tell how good a glass of Budweiser was. I could tell how good a glass of Michelob was. But when I started working there, Michelob wasn't even put in bottles or cans. It was only draft beer. So those were 2 great beers. Now there's 12 flavors of Michelob and equal 12 flavors of you know, this has changed the whole complexion. What in fairness to Feigenstein and Ballantine, all of those brewers, including Anheuser-Busch, took great pride in their beer brands, and they had excellent quality control so that the beer always tasted the same. Well, some of those brewers that went out of business, their beers didn't taste good because they didn't maintain the good quality control. But what happens now is, you know, I don't know how to put it. Do you want a pumpkin flavored Halloween? That's the stuff that's causing all this turmoil in the industry, you know? So I, for the sake of the people that are working at Newark, I hope the place stays there because it's a situation that I personally am glad I'm not there in management any longer because all those people, you want them to have the jobs and you want the business to stay and be prosperous, but the other side of the coin, it's all going elsewhere. So that someday, if InBev sees that one place is costing too much to produce the beer, that's the place that's going to possibly go down the drain. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about the water. I heard somewhere that the Budweiser factory had a special channel built to bring in water from the Pequannock down there. Is that true, or is there?
Let me say this, that with respect to water, I mentioned several times the importance of quality control. Quality control, one of the reasons Newark was chosen when they built the Newark Brewery was you had excellent quality water. And all water from all 12 breweries, essentially, before the brewing starts on a specific brew for that day, if they're brewing Michelob, that water has to meet a certain standard. And that is adjusted in the brew house by brewing and by quality control. So it always begins with the same thing no matter where it is. And the standard at Anheuser-Busch, and I'm sure that they're doing it to this day, is quality control is paramount, so that of all major brews that are brewed at every several days, they're literally shipped to St. Louis to ensure that all of that quality remains the same. So there, in that respect, you're getting the quality that the people have come to expect. And I think that the breweries that failed in this area, many of them, they didn't even have quality control departments in that era. You know.
Yes.
I was just wondering, in anyone's research, did they find that there was a big variation in the recipes that the beer companies were using? Like, did that generate any competition?
Yes.
I know they had a niche market. Yeah.
You know, like.
I mean, before Anheuser.
On the house, that beer is made with water, with yeast, with barley malt, or with wheat malt, and with hops. There are 28, to my recollection, there are 28 different kinds of hops. There's also 5 or 6 different kinds of grains that can be used to make the barley malt, or rice malt, or wheat malt, whatever it is. Then the process of using yeast to make the fermentation, and like the fermentation that was used to make Anheuser-Busch products, we never used artificial carbonation like you should use when you make a Coca-Cola. Carbonated is not built into the soda. Whereas with beer, that fermentation takes place, and that's what causes the carbonation.
But even pre-prohibition, I was just
Yeah, I was more interested in, you know, the competing breweries, their tales. I know Blue was as well. Yeah, the whole process.
The change happened when the Germans came. I mean, Ballantine didn't brew lager beer, which is the traditional Anheuser-Busch beer, Miller, whatever that we know now. Ballantine, for the most part, built English-type ales, like brown ale and porters and stout, that kind of beer. That's what they brewed up, and because what Milt says, it wasn't pasteurized. So, and they were able to, that beer would last a little bit longer because of the way they made it. Then the reason why most of the brewers moved out west, or because they, huge German populations moved to Wisconsin with them, they had the caves out there. So what they used to do, they would cut chunks of ice out of the lakes and then brew the beer and then store the barrels in the caves that stayed roughly 40 degrees all year round. So they were able to store some of the beer in the caves in Wisconsin, and that's why a lot of those brewers, you know, located themselves there. That was according to, there's a great book Maureen Ogle wrote, and I found that in my research. I forget the name, I have to look at my footnotes, but she wrote a great book on Western brewers. If you're interested in the history of like Pabst and Schlitz, and these guys were pretty dynamic too. They were just like, they were all the same. Like what Milt says, they were beer, you know, Anheuser-Busch and all those, the founders, they were fast and loose with stuff back then. Sure.
Go with one last question and we'll get people on the road.
So pre-Prohibition, maybe 1900 or so, you're talking about Kruger and Feigenstein. How big is the market for these guys? It seems so difficult to transport the stuff. Does Ballantine sell 5 miles away or 10 miles away, or does it sell in Pennsylvania?
Well, at the time, they were expanding their markets. Like, if my memory is correct, they were producing about 1 million barrels a year. Well, some of that was going out of state and to other markets. But the cost of shipping that stuff, of getting the materials into brew it and then ship it after it's finished, those were costs that they normally have to or not incur.
The way I understand Ballantine was more like a regional beer in the New York metropolitan area, and then they were overtaken by the Midwestern brewers like Anheuser-Busch, you know, post-World War II.
Post-World War II.
There were 17 pretty major brewers in the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area in the 1945 to 60 years.
In 1899, there were 16, and they employed about 1,200 people. In 1909, there was only 14, and they employed more people, 1,540. That's the numbers I got.
But did they...
In the Newark area, yeah, Newark area, yeah.
How far away were they selling?
Well, they had to compete against the New York brewers because there was brewers there. They were selling basically in this northern Jersey area.
They were selling in
Essex County and wherever, how far they could get their beer out to.
Why don't we end with that? We're going to have Tim Chris make one last plate and we'll get you back home. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you to all of you for coming. If you're not on our mailing list, make sure that we get your email address. We'll be happy to let you know about our future programs.